The sun was burning hotter than usual that afternoon, the kind of heat that makes the air feel heavy and every step feels slower. Alicia, a young pregnant black woman in her third trimester, walked out of the small corner store with a bottle of cold water in her hand. She had felt dizzy inside the store, so she bought the water and stepped outside to get some fresh air, but the moment she exited, a wave of heat hit her again. Stronger this time, making her breathing unsteady. She placed one hand on her belly, whispering softly, "Okay baby, mommy just needs a minute." There was a metal bench near the wall, but it was too hot to sit on, so she chose to sit on the small shaded step near the store entrance. She didn't block the doorway. She simply sat a little to the side, leaning carefully against the wall. Her face was a little pale, and she closed her eyes, hoping the dizziness would pass. People walked in and out of the store, most of them giving her a kind glance, some asking if she was okay. She smiled weakly and nodded. "Just the heat," she whispered. A few minutes passed before a police cruiser pulled into the parking lot. Two officers stepped out, one older and one younger. They looked irritated, not because of her, but because of the heat. One officer wiped his forehead and muttered, "Why is it so hot today?" Then he noticed Alicia sitting near the entrance. Instead of assuming she was resting, he frowned. "What's she doing there?" he asked. The younger officer shrugged. "Probably causing trouble." They didn't even ask the store owner, who was standing behind the counter and clearly saw Alicia was just taking a moment to rest. Instead, they walked straight toward her with heavy boots, making their presence loud and intimidating. Alicia opened her eyes when she heard them approaching. The older officer pointed at her. "Ma'am, you need to move," he said sharply, as if she were blocking the whole building. She tried to speak calmly. "Sir, I just need a second, I'm feeling dizzy." But the officer didn't listen. "I said move," he repeated, louder this time, as if she were doing something wrong. She placed her hands on the ground to push herself up slowly, but her legs trembled. She wasn't pretending. She truly struggled to stand. The younger officer rolled his eyes. "Oh, please don't start acting sick," he said. "You're not the only one dealing with the heat." A few bystanders stopped and stared. Some pulled out their phones, sensing something didn't feel right. A woman at the bus stop whispered, "She's pregnant." Why are they yelling at her? Alicia felt her heart beating faster, not from fear for herself but from fear for her baby. She tried again to stand, but her knees wobbled and she sank back down gently. I'm trying," she whispered, her voice shaky. The older officer lost patience. "Get up now," he said, stepping closer. The younger one added, "We don't have time for this drama." Then, without a second thought, the older officer grabbed the cold water bottle from her hand, opened it halfway, and splashed water directly onto her face. "Wake up," he said. "You're not fainting, you're just causing a scene." The crowd gasped loudly. A man shouted, "Hey, she's pregnant. What are you doing?" A teenager began recording immediately, capturing every moment in clear detail. Alicia flinched as the cold water hit her face. It wasn't refreshing. It was humiliating, shocking, and painful. She placed her hand on her stomach again, feeling a sharp cramp from the stress. "Please, please don't," she whispered, tears forming in the corners of her eyes. But the officers didn't stop. The younger one shook his head and muttered, "If you can't stand, maybe you shouldn't be sitting in public places." His tone was so cruel that even people passing by turned to look. A man near the door said angrily, "She's not hurting anyone. Leave her alone." The officer snapped back, "Do you want to be arrested too?" The man stepped away but kept recording, trembling with anger. Alicia tried one more time to stand, pushing her hand against the wall for support, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Her legs were weak, her stomach tight, and her breath short. "I'm pregnant," she said softly. "I just need a moment." But the officers ignored her like they hadn't heard a single word. "Stand up," the older one repeated, growing frustrated. Another man said loudly, "She's not a threat. Why are you treating her like this?" But the officers acted like the crowd didn't exist. A woman stepped forward. "Let me help her." But the younger officer held up his hand. "Back up," he warned. "We'll handle it." But they weren't handling anything. They were escalating it, destroying her dignity, and putting her and her unborn baby in danger. Tears finally rolled down Alicia's cheeks, not from the water, but from the fear settling deep inside her chest. She reached slowly for her purse, her hands shaking badly. The officers immediately tensed. "Stop reaching," the younger one yelled, placing his hand on his holster. The crowd screamed in panic. "She's pregnant. She's scared. She's not reaching for a weapon." Alicia froze, afraid to move even a finger. Her voice trembled. I'm just trying to call my husband." Her words were soft, desperate, and full of pain. And at that moment, no one, not even the officers, knew the truth. Her husband was the sheriff. A man who did not tolerate injustice. A man who did not forgive mistreatment. A man who was about to change this entire situation in minutes. The moment Alicia whispered that she was trying to call her husband, the tension in the air grew even thicker. The officers didn't hear her words carefully. They only saw her reaching into her purse, and that was enough for them to panic in the wrong way. The younger officer shouted again, "Stop reaching." His voice echoed through the small parking lot, creating fear instead of safety. People in the growing crowd gasped and one woman yelled, "She's pregnant." "She's scared." "Why are you yelling at her like that?" Alicia froze with her hand only halfway inside her purse. Her whole body trembled as she held her breath. The dizziness had returned stronger than before. Her vision blurred slightly. She knew she wasn't safe. Not with the heat, not with the panic, not with the stress crushing her chest. She tried to swallow but her throat felt tight. "I just need help," she whispered softly, barely audible. But the officers weren't listening. They were too busy asserting control, too busy proving something unnecessary. The older officer stepped closer, towering over her. "You don't move until we tell you," he barked. He didn't see her fear. He didn't see her swollen belly trembling. He didn't see the sweat on her forehead. Not from the heat, but from panic. A man in the crowd spoke loudly. "Why don't you help her instead of scaring her?" The older officer turned his head sharply. "Mind your business," he snapped. The man stepped back but didn't stop recording. His hands shook with anger, not fear. Finally, with her hands raised slightly to show she wasn't a threat, Alicia said in a trembling voice, "I'm calling my husband. Please, just let me call him." She moved slowly, so slowly that even the crowd could see she was terrified of making the wrong motion. Her fingers brushed her phone, and she pulled it out carefully like someone disarming a bomb. The crowd held their breath. She unlocked the screen with shaky fingers and pressed one single name, the only name she trusted in that moment. Marcus? Her husband. Her protector. Her anchor. She pressed the phone to her ear and her voice cracked as she whispered, "Baby, please? I need you." She didn't even get to explain. He heard everything. The fear, the trembling breath, the tears she was trying to hide, and that was enough. On the other end, Marcus Taylor, the sheriff of the entire county, stood up so fast his chair flew back and hit the wall behind him. His deputies jumped in surprise. "Sheriff? What happened?" Marcus didn't explain. He didn't waste a second. All he said was, "My wife's in trouble." His voice was deep, sharp, and shaking with protective rage. Back at the store, the younger officer rolled his eyes. "Who are you calling? Your boyfriend?" He mocked cruelly. A woman in the crowd snapped at him. "She said she's calling her husband." He ignored her. "Doesn't matter," he said under his breath. "She's still causing problems." The crowd murmured angrily. "She's not causing anything." "You are," another man shouted. Meanwhile, Alicia could barely speak. "Marcus, there." Her breath caught. She held her stomach, feeling a tight cramp. "They're yelling at me. I can't stand." Before she could finish, Marcus's voice came through the phone like a bullet, firm and commanding. "Alicia, stay where you are," he said. "Don't move, I'm coming right now." His voice softened for half a second. "Just breathe, honey. I'm on my way." He hung up before she could reply and rushed out of his office. He didn't take a patrol car, he didn't activate sirens, he didn't radio a warning. He drove his personal black SUV, the one everyone in the department recognized, the one officers knew belonged to the sheriff. The man who commanded the entire force. The man whose respect you never wanted to lose. Back at the store, the officers still showed no sign of stopping. The older one waved his hand dismissively. "You have 30 seconds to get up or we're removing you." A woman cried out. "She can't stand. She's fainting." But the officers ignored the pleas, ignored her condition, ignored the truth written on every face watching them. Alicia placed her hand on the wall again, trying to push herself up, but her body didn't cooperate. Her knees buckled, and she slid back down, landing gently but painfully. She gasped, placing a hand on her belly, whispered, "Please, not now, please." The crowd erupted, shouting, "Stop. She's in pain. Are you blind? Look at her." But the officers remained stubborn, frustrated, and blind to their own cruelty. They didn't know who she was. They didn't know who she had called. They didn't know the storm that was racing toward them at that very second. Because miles away, Marcus's SUV was cutting through traffic like a blade. His hands gripping the wheel tightly. His heartbeat loud. His eyes burning with fear and fury. He didn't care about rules. He didn't care about speed limits. He only cared about one thing, getting to his wife. And in just a few minutes, those two officers would learn a truth that would drop them to their knees. They hadn't splashed water on just any woman. They had splashed water on the sheriff's wife. The sun felt even hotter as the minutes passed, but the real heat in the parking lot came from the tension between the officers and the growing crowd. Alicia sat on the ground again, holding her belly gently, her breath short and uneven. A few women tried to approach her, but the younger officer barked, Back up. All of you. His voice shook with frustration, not authority. He didn't know what he was doing, and everyone watching could see it clearly. People in the crowd shouted again, "She's pregnant. She needs help." A man yelled, "Call an ambulance." But the officers ignored every cry, every plea, every sign of distress. The older one shook his head. "She's faking it," he said loudly, making sure everyone heard. "People pretend to be sick all the time to avoid cooperating." His voice carried arrogance. The kind that hides fear, the kind that refuses to admit a mistake. Meanwhile, Alicia's phone screen dimmed in her shaky hand, the call with Marcus already over. Her heart pounded painfully as she whispered, "Please hurry, baby." She didn't know exactly where he was. Only that when she said she needed him, he moved like a man with fire in his veins. Her husband was known throughout the county for being a calm, fair, and highly respected sheriff. But when it came to his family, he was a storm. Back on the road, Marcus was driving faster than he ever had, his jaw clenched tightly, eyes focused like a predator heading toward danger. His mind repeated the same image over and over. His pregnant wife, scared and alone, surrounded by officers who were supposed to protect people like her. His chest burned with anger, but under that anger was fear, a fear he rarely felt, a fear that something might happen to her or the baby. As he turned into the neighborhood, he saw cars slowing down in front of him. He honked once, a deep, aggressive sound, and the cars moved aside as if they felt the authority in that horn. He didn't use his siren, but every driver sensed something important, something urgent, something powerful. His hands tightened around the steering wheel as he approached the store street, and from halfway down the block, he could already see a crowd gathering. His heart dropped into his stomach. He pressed the gas harder, sending his SUV flying toward the parking lot. The moment the crowd saw the black SUV speeding in, people stepped aside quickly. Some whispered, "Who is that?" Others murmured, "That's law enforcement. Look at the plates." A teenager zoomed his phone camera in and whispered, "Dude, that's the sheriff's car." The older officer finally noticed the commotion and glanced up. He frowned when he saw the SUV screeching to a stop. "Who the hell?" he started to say, but the words died in his throat when he saw the emblem. The door opened with a force that made the whole crowd flinch, and then he stepped out. Sheriff Marcus Taylor. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a calm but dangerous presence. His face was carved with fury he was trying desperately to control. His eyes scanned the crowd like a man on a mission, until they finally landed on his wife sitting on the ground, pale and shaking. His heart smashed into 1,000 pieces at that sight. "Alicia!" he shouted, his voice cracking. He rushed forward, pushing past the crowd. People stepped aside instantly, making a path for him without being asked. He ran to her and dropped to his knees. "Baby, I'm here. I'm here. Look at me." His hands trembled as he held her face gently. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" "Did they?" She shook her head weakly, tears falling. "They splashed water on me," they yelled. "I couldn't stand." Marcus closed his eyes for 1 second. One dangerous second. And in that moment, the entire crowd felt the air change. The anger inside him wasn't loud, it wasn't wild. It was something far more terrifying, cold, controlled, and ready to strike. He stood up slowly, turning his head toward the officers. And the moment they saw his face clearly, both men froze completely. The younger officer whispered, "No. No way." The older one stepped backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. That's the sheriff?" The crowd murmured loudly. They didn't know. They splashed water on the sheriff's wife. A woman whispered, "Oh, they're done, they're done." Marcus took one slow step toward the officers, and with each step, the officers' faces drained of all color. The younger one's knees buckled, and he stumbled back into the wall. The older one held out a shaky hand as if that could protect him. "Sheriff, this isn't, we didn't, sir, please." Marcus didn't need to shout. His voice was low, trembling with a rage deeper than anything the officers had ever heard. "You laid hands on my wife," he said quietly. "You splashed water on a pregnant woman, while she begged for help." The younger officer swallowed hard, unable to speak. "You ignored her pain," Marcus continued, stepping closer. "You ignored every warning, every person telling you she was pregnant." The older officer tried again. "Sheriff, we made a mistake." Marcus's eyes narrowed sharply. "A mistake?" he repeated, each word cutting like a knife. "No, a mistake is paperwork." This was cruelty. The officers stood frozen, unable to run, unable to speak, unable to breathe properly. Because the sheriff had arrived. And they knew their careers, their badges, and their respect were about to fall apart. The moment Sheriff Marcus took that final step toward the officers, the entire parking lot felt like it had stopped breathing. Even the heat seemed to pause, hanging in the air like it was afraid to move. People watched with wide eyes, phones recording from every angle, waiting to see what would happen next. The officers stood stiff like statues, fear spreading through their bodies faster than the heat ever could. The older officer finally managed to speak, but his voice cracked. "Sheriff, sir, we didn't know she was your wife." The words came out wrong, too quick, too desperate. The crowd reacted instantly. "So if she wasn't his wife, you think it's okay?" A man shouted. "Exactly," another yelled. "You shouldn't treat anyone like that." The younger officer rubbed his forehead nervously, realizing his excuse had only made things worse. Marcus's expression remained calm, but dangerously calm. His eyes didn't blink, didn't soften, didn't shift. He stared directly at the officers, his voice low enough that everyone leaned in to hear. "You splashed water on a pregnant woman," he said slowly. "You yelled at her, you threatened her, you ignored her when she said she was dizzy, and you ignored the entire crowd telling you she needed help." The younger officer swallowed hard. "Sheriff, we thought she was pretending." Marcus stepped closer, his presence towering over them now. "Pretending?" he repeated, voice like ice. "Pretending to faint? Pretending to struggle to breathe? Pretending to protect her baby?" The younger officer's legs wobbled again, and he grabbed onto the wall behind him to stay standing. A woman from the crowd stepped forward, anger boiling in her eyes. She was hardly standing. She looked like she was about to pass out. "And you two just kept yelling." A man behind her added loudly. "They splashed water on her like she was nothing." The crowd's frustration grew, but no one dared step between Marcus and the officers. Everyone could see the storm in his eyes, a storm barely being controlled. Marcus turned his head slightly, just enough to look at Alicia sitting on the ground with a woman fanning her gently. His jaw tightened when he saw his wife still holding her belly with trembling fingers. He looked back at the officers and something inside him snapped, not in noise but in resolve. "Give me your badges," he said quietly. The officers froze, staring at him in disbelief as if the words couldn't be real. The older one stuttered, "Sheriff, we..." Marcus didn't raise his voice, didn't move quickly, but his next words were strong enough to hit them like thunder. "I said," he repeated slowly, "give me your badges. Now." It was not a request. It was not a suggestion. It was a command. The kind that ends careers. The younger officer looked like he might faint, his fingers shaking as he reached for the metal badge pinned to his chest. The older officer's eyes filled with tears. "Sir, I've been on the force for 15 years, he whispered. "This job means everything to me." Marcus didn't blink. "Then you should have acted like it meant something," he said sharply. "A badge is a responsibility, not a weapon." His words hit the crowd so deeply that even people recording lowered their phones for a moment. The older officer's hands shook violently as he unpinned his badge, holding it out toward Marcus like it weighed 100 pounds. The younger officer followed, placing his badge in the sheriff's hand without saying a word. The sound of the metal dropping into Marcus's palm echoed like a final judgment. "You're both suspended," Marcus said firmly, "effective immediately." The officers winced as if the words physically hurt them. The younger officer tried one last desperate attempt. "Sheriff, please, we didn't know." Marcus stepped closer until they could feel his breath. "You didn't need to know," he said, "to treat her with respect." The crowd erupted with murmurs of agreement. "Exactly. He's right." Finally someone said it. A teenager holding his phone whispered, "This is going viral tonight." "I swear." His friend nodded, "And it should." Marcus handed the badges to a deputy who had just arrived, the deputy nodding with a tense but understanding expression. Then Marcus knelt beside Alicia again, wiping her cheeks gently. "You're safe now," he whispered. "I'm here." Alicia leaned her head against his shoulder, tears still falling softly. "I was so scared," she whispered. "I know," he said, kissing her forehead. "I'm so sorry you had to go through this." The older officer watched the moment, feeling guilt crushing him like a mountain. He whispered, "We didn't mean to hurt her." The crowd snapped. "Yes, you did. You didn't care at all. You treated her like trash." The officer lowered his head, realizing there was nothing he could say to defend himself. Just then, the sound of an ambulance siren approached slowly, not rushed but steady. The paramedics stepped out and immediately went to Alicia, gently checking her pulse, blood pressure, and the baby's condition. Their voices were calm, soothing, respectful. Everything the officers had not been, she stressed. One paramedic said softly, "But the baby seems okay, we'll take her to the hospital to be sure." Marcus nodded. "Take her," he said. "I'm riding with her." The paramedics helped Alicia onto a stretcher while the crowd parted respectfully. Several people placed comforting hands on her arm as she was wheeled past, whispering, "You're strong. We're with you. You didn't deserve this." The officers stood silently at the side, pale and trembling. They looked like they might collapse any second. Not because the sheriff yelled. Not because the crowd was angry. but because they finally understood the weight of what they had done. And the consequences were only just beginning. The ambulance doors closed gently, and for the first time since everything started, Alicia felt a small sense of safety. The paramedics worked quietly around her, checking her pulse, giving her cool air, and speaking to her with calm, human voices, something she desperately needed after the cruelty she faced. Marcus sat beside her, holding her hand with both of his thumb gently rubbing over her knuckles. His eyes never left her face, not even for a second. He took slow breaths, trying to keep himself calm for her sake, but inside he was still shaking with rage. As the ambulance drove toward the hospital, the crew asked her soft questions. Are you feeling dizzy? Any pain in your stomach? Any shortness of breath? Alicia answered quietly, her voice still trembling. Just scared. The paramedic nodded kindly. You're safe now, she whispered. We're going to take good care of you. Marcus looked at the paramedic with grateful eyes, as if her kindness was easing the weight on his chest. But even as the ambulance moved forward, the situation behind them wasn't over. The two officers stood in the parking lot, pale as ghosts, watching the ambulance drive away. The crowd hadn't left. People stayed because they wanted justice. They wanted answers, they wanted accountability. Some shouted at the officers, "You almost hurt that baby. You didn't care at all." Others recorded their nervous faces as evidence. "This is going online," someone said. "People need to see this." One of Marcus's deputies approached the officers. "You're both required to ride with me to the station," he said firmly. "Sheriff ordered it." The officers exchanged terrified glances. They had never thought anything would come back to them. They were used to being in control, used to people backing down, but not today. Today they were the ones shrinking under authority. The deputy guided them toward the car, and for the first time, the officers didn't resist. They knew better. Meanwhile, the ambulance reached the hospital. Nurses rushed out to meet them, guiding Alicia into an emergency room. Marcus walked beside her stretcher the whole time, refusing to let go of her hand. "She's 8 months pregnant," he told every nurse who approached. She was stressed, almost fainted. "She needs a full checkup." His voice was firm, but there was pain hidden in it. Pain he hadn't shown at the scene. Pain he didn't want the officers to see. The doctor arrived quickly. "We'll do an ultrasound and monitor the baby's heart rate," he said calmly. "We'll take it from here." Marcus nodded but didn't loosen his grip. "I'm staying with her," he said, and the doctor understood instantly. "Of course," he replied. "You stay." Inside the room, the beeping of machines and the soft hum of air conditioning filled the silence. Alicia lay on the bed, still shaken, her hands holding her belly protectively. Marcus sat beside her, trying to smile. "You're strong," he whispered. "You're so strong." She closed her eyes, letting tears fall. "I thought something would happen to the baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "When they yelled at me, when they splashed the water. I thought." Marcus leaned forward, placing his forehead against hers. "Nothing's going to happen," he whispered firmly. "I won't let anything happen." A nurse began the ultrasound, and a few seconds later, a strong, steady heartbeat filled the room. Alicia burst into relieved tears as Marcus exhaled a long, shaky breath he had been holding since he got her call. "There," the nurse said softly, smiling at them. "Your baby is doing just fine." The words washed over Marcus like cold water on a fire, relieving his rage just enough to think clearly again. But the peace didn't last long. Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. Once, twice, then again he answered. "Sheriff Taylor," his deputy's voice came through, tense and serious. "Sir." "The two officers are at the station." Marcus closed his eyes briefly, tightening his jaw. "Good," he said quietly. "Process them for misconduct and hold them there until I arrive," his deputy replied. "Yes, sir." "The chief wants to talk to you too," Marcus nodded. "Tell him I'll be there as soon as my wife is stable." He hung up and looked back at Alicia. "They're at the station," he said softly. "Everything is being handled." Alicia nodded weakly. "Good," she whispered, then she looked into his eyes and added something he didn't expect. "Marcus, don't hurt them." He blinked, surprised. "Hurt them?" She nodded again. "They were wrong, but don't let this change who you are." Her words landed deeply, calming something inside him. He held her hand tighter. "I won't," he promised softly, "but I will make sure they never do this to anyone else." A nurse entered again with paperwork. "She'll need to stay for monitoring for a few hours," she said. Marcus nodded. "We'll stay as long as needed." But as he sat there, holding his wife's hand under the dim hospital light, something inside him shifted. A quiet promise. A vow. A storm with purpose. Those officers had crossed a line. And before the night ended, they would face consequences. Not out of anger, but out of justice. Because no one harms a pregnant woman and walks away untouched. Especially when that woman belongs to the sheriff. Marcus stayed with Alicia until her breathing was steady and the nurse confirmed her vitals were normal. Even then, he didn't want to leave. His hand stayed locked around hers like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. But Alicia looked at him gently, her voice soft but steady. "Go," she whispered. "Handle what you need to handle." "I'll be okay now." Marcus shook his head. "I don't want to leave you." She touched his arm. "You're the sheriff," she whispered. "Do your job, finish what they started." Those words hit him deeper than any order, deeper than any command. He leaned down, kissed her forehead and whispered, "I'll be back soon." Then he stood up, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp. The storm inside him hadn't died. It had simply become controlled, focused, ready. He walked out of the hospital room slowly, but once the door closed, his steps turned firm, powerful, almost dangerous. When he exited the hospital building, his deputy was already waiting outside, standing straight with a serious expression. "Sheriff," he said, "are you ready to head to the station?" Marcus didn't answer with words. He opened the SUV door and got inside, face calm, heart burning. The drive to the police station was silent except for the sound of the tires on the road. His deputy glanced at him a few times, noticing the tension. "Sir," he finally said quietly, "everyone at the station already heard what happened. They're waiting." Marcus didn't react. "Good," he said simply, "they should hear it." When they arrived at the station, the atmosphere was different. Heavy, nervous, thick with whispers. Officers stood around in small groups, speaking in low voices. Many looked afraid, some looked ashamed. A few looked furious that two officers had embarrassed the entire department. But every single person fell silent when Marcus walked through the doors. He didn't shout, he didn't slam anything, he didn't even look around. He walked like a man with a purpose. A man who was about to make decisions that couldn't be undone. His boots echoed in the hallway, loud, slow, steady, and every sound felt like a warning. The two officers were inside the conference room, sitting stiffly, badges gone, faces pale, sweat beading along their foreheads. They looked like criminals waiting for judgment, not officers waiting for explanations. When Marcus entered the room, they stood up automatically, out of habit, out of fear. "Sit," he said quietly. They sat instantly. Marcus didn't sit, he remained standing, pacing slowly in front of them. His voice was soft, but the softness was terrifying. "Tell me what happened," he said. The older officer swallowed hard. "Sheriff, it wasn't like—" "Stop," Marcus said, raising one hand. His voice didn't rise, but it hit like a command carved in stone. "Start from the beginning, and tell me the truth." The younger officer's voice cracked first. "Sir, we got a call about someone blocking the entrance. When we arrived we saw her sitting there." Marcus watched them with unblinking eyes. "Did you ask her if she was okay?" The younger officer looked down. "No, sir." "Did you ask if she was pregnant?" "No, sir." "Did you listen to the crowd telling you she needed help?" "No, sir." "Did you splash water on her?" Silence filled the room like a weapon. Then finally, "Yes, sir." Marcus inhaled once through his nose, slow, deep, controlled, but his eyes burned with something sharp and cold. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why would you do that to a woman who could barely stand?" The older officer stuttered. "We thought she was faking." Marcus slammed his hand on the table, not out of rage but out of pure disbelief. The officers jumped like they'd been struck. "Faking?" he said. "Faking dizziness? Faking fear? Faking pregnancy?" The older officer's voice broke. "Sir, we didn't know she was your wife." Marcus leaned in slowly, dangerously close. "This is not about her being my wife," he shouted for the first time. His voice shook the room. "This is about you having no humanity." The officers flinched, tears forming in their eyes. Marcus straightened, breathing heavily, but then his expression changed, calmer, colder, more controlled. "You think the only reason you're here is because she's my wife?" he asked, his voice low again. "No. You're here because you treated a pregnant woman like an animal. Because you forgot what your badge stands for. Because you chose cruelty over compassion." Neither officer dared to speak. They were afraid of the silence more than his words. One of them whispered, "Sir, please don't end our careers." Marcus stared at them with eyes that felt like burning steel. "Your careers ended the moment you splashed water on a crying pregnant woman," he said softly. "You ended them yourselves." A long silence filled the room. Then Marcus spoke the final words they dreaded more than anything. "You're both fired." His voice didn't shake. "Effective immediately." The officers collapsed into their chairs, one covering his face with his hands, the other crying silently. Their fear, guilt, and shame had finally caught up to them. Marcus walked to the door, hand on the handle, but before leaving he turned back one last time. "And pray," he said quietly, "pray that my wife and child remain healthy, because if anything happens to them because of your actions, firing you will be the smallest consequence you face." Then he left the room. And the entire station knew. Justice had only just begun. As Marcus walked out of the conference room, the entire station fell silent. Officers who usually joked, talked, and moved freely now stood stiff like bricks, watching him with wide, tense eyes. No one dared to speak. No one dared to breathe too loudly. The sheriff's rage wasn't explosive anymore. It was quiet, cold, and far more terrifying. Word had already traveled through the halls. 2 officers were fired on the spot for mistreating a pregnant woman. And now everyone knew who that pregnant woman was. Marcus walked down the hallway without looking at anyone, but everyone stepped aside. Some lowered their heads in shame, others in respect. A few approached him with trembling voices. "Sheriff, we're so sorry, sir. This should have never happened. We're praying for your wife." Marcus only nodded, but his jaw remained tight. "Just do better," he said quietly, "all of you." Back at the hospital, Alicia was resting inside a dimly lit room, the ultrasound machine still standing beside her bed. Her hand was resting gently on her stomach, feeling the small kicks from her baby, signs of life, signs of hope. The nurse had turned the lights low so she could rest, and the room felt calm, peaceful, and safe. But outside her room, the hospital halls were buzzing with energy. A few people who had been in the parking lot had rushed to the hospital to check on her, and they were telling doctors, nurses, even security guards what had happened. 2 officers splashed water on her. One woman said, "She could barely stand." Another man added, "It was all recorded, the whole town is going to see it." And they were right. Because while Alicia lay quietly in her hospital bed, unaware of what was happening outside, the video of the incident was already exploding online. The teenager who recorded everything had posted a 1-minute clip with the caption, "Pregnant woman harassed by police. Crowd saves her." Within 10 minutes, the video hit 1,000 views, then 10,000, then 20. Comments flooded the post. "This is sick. She could have lost her baby. Fire them immediately. Where was the sheriff?" And one comment that stood out. "The sheriff is her husband. This is about to get serious." Inside the hospital room, Alicia opened her eyes slowly, the beeping of the heartbeat monitor steady beside her. The nurse entered with a soft smile. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Alicia nodded weakly. "Better? Just tired." The nurse touched her arm gently. "Your baby is strong," she said, "and so are you." As she spoke, the door opened and Marcus walked in slowly. His hard, tense expression melted the moment his eyes landed on her. He rushed to her side, sitting down and taking her hand again. "How are you feeling, baby?" he asked softly. Alicia gave a tiny smile. "Your daughter kicked me 5 times, she whispered. "I think she's trying to calm me down." Marcus chuckled under his breath, the first real laugh he had since the incident. "She's a fighter," he whispered, "just like her mom." They shared a quiet moment, breathing together, safe together, but the peace was interrupted when Marcus's phone buzzed repeatedly in his pocket. 5 times in a row, he frowned and checked it. Dozens of messages, notifications, missed calls. His deputy had texted, "Sheriff, the video is online. It's everywhere." Another message from the police chief. "Call me. Now." And one more from an unknown number. "Press is outside the station." Marcus closed his eyes briefly, then he looked at Alicia and said softly, "Everything is blowing up." She nodded slowly. "I knew it would," she whispered. "People saw what happened." Marcus squeezed her hand. "Are you okay with the public knowing?" he asked gently. "It's your story, you decide." Alicia took a slow breath, then said, "If it stops them from hurting someone else, let the world see it." Her voice was calm, but her eyes were strong, filled with the quiet courage that Marcus loved about her. He kissed her forehead again. "I'll make sure they never wear a uniform again," he said softly. "That's a promise." At that moment, the doctor entered the room with a warm smile. "Good news," he said. "Your baby is healthy and you're stable. You'll need to stay a few more hours, but everything looks good." Alicia smiled with relief. Marcus whispered, "Thank God." As the doctor left, Alicia said quietly, "You should go handle the press, the station, everything." Marcus shook his head. "Not leaving you again?" But she insisted, placing her hand on his cheek. "Marcus, you already did the hardest part, the rest is your job." He finally nodded, knowing she was right. He stood up slowly, kissed her again and whispered, "I'll be back before you know it." When he stepped out of the hospital room, reporters were already gathering near the entrance, microphones in hand, cameras ready. Security was trying to keep them back, shouting, "Stay behind the line." Marcus walked toward them, shoulders squared, face calm but fierce. Every camera turned toward him. Every voice shouted his name. Every microphone reached forward. But Marcus didn't flinch. He looked directly at the crowd and said in a deep, steady voice, "I have a statement and I won't be holding anything back." And the world listened. The flashing cameras lit up the hospital entrance like a storm of white sparks. Reporters surged forward the moment they saw Marcus step outside, their microphones raised, voices overlapping with questions that hit him from every direction. "Sheriff, is it true your wife was assaulted by officers? What happened at the store? Are the officers still employed? Do you plan to press charges?" The noise grew louder and louder, but Marcus didn't raise a hand, didn't shout for quiet, he simply stood tall, his presence alone making the crowd fall silent one microphone at a time. He took a breath, his eyes cold but calm. "What happened today," he said slowly, "should never happen to anyone, ever." The reporters leaned in, cameras recording every word, every expression, every breath. Marcus continued, "My wife, a pregnant woman 8 months along, was humiliated and mistreated in public by 2 officers sworn to protect this community." A few reporters gasped softly. They ignored her distress, ignored the crowd, and used unnecessary force, and then they splashed water on her while she begged for help. The crowd murmured loudly, some in shock, some in outrage, but Marcus didn't pause. "I want to make something very clear," he said. "My wife did not receive justice because she is married to the sheriff." He raised his voice slightly, making the next words hit with weight. "She received justice because what those officers did was wrong." A woman reporter stepped forward. "Sheriff, what will happen to them now?" Marcus nodded. "Both officers have been terminated." The cameras clicked rapidly, capturing the shock on people's faces. "Not suspended. Not reassigned. Fired." He paused, letting the message settle. Because a badge does not give anyone permission to disrespect, harm, or intimidate a pregnant woman, or any citizen. Upstairs, from her hospital window, Alicia watched her husband speak, her eyes filling with tears, not from pain but from pride. He wasn't defending her because she was his wife. He was defending her because she was a human being who deserved respect. And he was defending every person like her who didn't have the voice, the strength, or the chance to stand up for themselves. Back at the hospital entrance, Marcus continued, "I've launched a full internal investigation," he said. "Any officer who knew about this incident and stayed silent will also be questioned." A reporter asked, "Sheriff, do you think race played a role?" Marcus didn't blink. "I think bias played a role," he said. "And bias, no matter what form it takes, is poison in law enforcement." The truth hit the crowd like a wave. Reporters nodded. People watching the live stream online began flooding the comments with support, anger, and agreement. The entire county was listening now, and beyond the county, the entire state soon would be. A final reporter asked, "Sheriff, what is the condition of your wife and baby?" Marcus's expression softened for the first time. "They're safe," he said, voice gentler. "My daughter has a strong heartbeat and my wife is the strongest woman I know." Cameras captured the warmth behind his stern exterior, a side of him the public rarely saw. He ended the statement with words that made the world go silent. "Let this be a lesson," he said. "Respect should never depend on who someone is married to. It should be automatic because we're all human." The reporters lowered their microphones slowly, absorbing the weight of his message. He stepped back and walked inside the hospital without taking more questions, leaving them stunned and inspired. Hours later, Alicia was discharged and Marcus drove her home carefully. His hand never left hers the entire ride. At home, he helped her inside gently, his eyes never leaving her face for too long. She sat on the couch, holding her belly, when her phone started buzzing non-stop. Messages from strangers, from mothers, from women across the country who saw the video and wanted to support her. "You're so brave." One message said, "You didn't deserve what happened," said another. She smiled weakly. Tears forming again. "I didn't do anything," she whispered. "I just survived." Marcus sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Surviving is not just anything," he said softly, "it's strength." By evening, the video had millions of views. The story was trending everywhere. News channels, social media, radio, and even national broadcasts. People were marching outside the station calling for better training, better rules, better humanity, and they held signs that read, "Respect women. Pregnancy is not a threat. Humanity first. Justice for Alicia." Inside their quiet home, Alicia leaned against Marcus and whispered something he would never forget. "Maybe this happened," she said softly, "so no other woman would have to go through it again." Marcus kissed her forehead gently, "And that," he whispered, "is exactly why justice matters." The story didn't end with anger. It ended with change, with conversations, with voices rising for truth, and with a reminder the whole world needed to hear. Respect is not optional. Kindness is not optional. Humanity is not optional. Because one moment of cruelty from 2 officers changed everything. But one woman's strength, and one man's love for his family, changed even more.